And we're just grateful for this opportunity to dive into your word, to look into the Gospel of John, and specifically chapter 6. And especially you'd be with us as we study this. Help us to speak your words and your truths, and have open minds and open hearts to be receptive to ways we might need to change, and for better understanding to come to all of us as a result of this study. We're grateful for Stephen, his family, and all the work they're doing, and everybody who plays a role in making this family as special as it is. We ask that you continue to work on us, though. We know that we're not perfect, and we're trying to be like your son. So we have a long way to go, and we need your help. But as we see in this story, that a little bit can go a long way as far as the faith that we have and what we're willing to do. And we're just grateful for the opportunity to be called children of yours, to be disciples of your son, Jesus. And we ask that you'd help us do those things better each day, being lights in this world in the process, being a blessing to others because we've first been blessed and loved by you. Help us to bring more glory to your name. That's the goal, and help us all to get to be in heaven with you. And we're grateful for the inheritance that you set before us because of the special relationship that we can now have with you because of your son. Pray these things in his name. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so we're gonna try and cover the first 24 verses in John chapter 6. It's gonna cover the more controversial is not the right word, because the stuff in it's not bad, but maybe one of the more widely argued about passages in the Gospel of John. When you get to the latter half, or the second half, where Jesus starts telling people that his body is food and his blood is drink, that causes a bit of a stir among the people. And Christians, believers throughout history, have understood John 6 in different ways. And so it's one of those passages where when you come to it, you really need to have context for it, and maybe a feel for the theological approach that John takes throughout his gospel. And so with leaving that as kind of an introduction for what is coming, we're going to run up into the discussion today with Jesus feeding 5,000 plus people. And then that is going to lead into the issue with people wanting more food from him. And despite the fact that I, even in the past, have said that they were only interested in the food, they did want more food. Oh, I can see you now, Bob. They did want more food, but there is a reason why. And so I think as we go through the text, we'll see that. Hopefully it'll make sense, and we'll continue next week what we talk about today. So with that, let's look at the first 15 verses there in John chapter 6. We kind of get Jesus going over to the sea. This is where he's going to be feeding the 5,000 people. What are some things that stand out to you guys, or what are some details that you thought were important in those first 15 verses?
Well, David, I may just leave that off. I think, again, thinking about the whole purpose that John is doing here in the gospel is he's trying to cause the people, first of all, to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. I mean, and by believing in him, one will have life. But looking at the first 15 verses of the feeding of the 5,000, we might want to set the stage. First of all, you see these overtones of the Exodus that John highlights in his gospel account. We see in verse 4, we start off with the Passover and saying the Passover was near. And then you go on in that he continues this imagery, if you would, of pointing to the Exodus that other gospel accounts really do not cover. It talks about Jesus crossing the sea and going up in the mountain, similar to what Moses did in the Exodus. And you see this large multitude that's following Jesus across the sea, and which was similar to what Moses did and going up into the mountains also. And then you see the episode of crossing the sea and going to the wilderness. Might note that it's my understanding that on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, where people followed after Jesus, that was a fairly barren hillside, hilly area, as I understand. But I think in all of this, as he as he looks toward this and discusses this in the first part of chapter 6, and this parallel back to the Exodus and everything, that he wants us to basically, I think, maybe have firmly in our minds that there's a new Exodus occurring. So just a quick introduction.
Yeah, and I think what you said is incredibly important for understanding the second half of the chapter. If you miss that you're getting another Exodus here, or at least an echo back to it, I think there's so many plays back to Exodus throughout the New Testament. If you miss that, I think it becomes extremely easy to misunderstand John chapter 6, which is why I think it happens so frequently throughout history, because if you miss those echoes, then you're going to miss, I think, the beauty of what John is doing. I agree with you completely. I think that's exactly right. Anything else you guys notice?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that you had mentioned previously to this was that the Gospel of John is primarily, the audience would be primarily Gentile. And I think that's kind of interesting here in the context of the first part of this chapter. And we see even right off the bat, depending on how your text reads, it has the Sea of Galilee, and then it says, or Tiberias. And so it's the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. So there's a couple different renderings of that in different versions. But, I've heard both those names, that I don't always equate those two things as the same, like it's the same sea. So he's going to the other side of Sea of Galilee, and it's the same Sea of Tiberias. It's not like he's crossing into something different, but it speaks to the more Gentile population. So an alternate name, Herod Antipas founded Tiberias, the largest city on the Sea of Galilee. So you kind of get more of a Roman feel for that. And I think you certainly see elements of Gentile readership kind of creeping in. We've certainly seen some of the stories in the previous chapters have more of a Gentile focus, and the Gentiles coming to Jesus. But yeah, I think that is also mentioned, verse 4 of the chapter. It says, now the Passover, a Jewish festival. I mean, like the Jewish people knew that was a Jewish festival. So the fact that he's kind of pointing that out kind of speaks to like, hey, not all of you know this. And so I think it's going to play out a little bit in this, the 5,000 being fed, 5,000 plus, like you said, being fed. I think there's some interesting parallels there that you alluded to, and I kind of looked into, that I think we'll see if you kind of have that as a context right up front.
I think that just to kind of touch on that again, in only tangentially related, when it comes to evangelism, when we're teaching somebody who is unfamiliar, we don't even realize sometimes how much religious jargon we use, religious words that have a meaning for us because of our background or what we've learned. And when you talk to somebody who has little or no knowledge of Christianity, we kind of have to take a cue from John here. John seems to be very careful to say something and then explain it, because if his Gentile readers had a map of Judea, their map was going to say the Sea of Tiberias. And so he's very careful to say, these are the same. I think you pointed out even the biggest, red flag of all is having to tell people what the Passover is. They're definitely not Jewish, like you said. And so I think you're exactly right. And I know that I'm guilty of this sometimes. I say things and I just expect people to know. And one of the great difficulties of being somebody who either has been raised in a religious or spiritual family, or somebody who is intensely spiritual and religious, is we forget what it's like to not know. And so we have to kind of be cognizant of the fact that whenever we're teaching somebody, make sure and explain things, and use language that is less religious. I don't mean say bad things, but explain things in a more common way so that you make sure you're not using vernacular or jargon. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, one other thing that I wanted to mention, but I could tell that it's just having trouble forming my words, but just this idea of this sort of being more of a Gentile bent, and you have those different references in there. See, See, I still can't quite think straight, but sorry. I should just write this down next time. Anyway, yeah, you have all these people connecting here, and yeah, I think it's important because there is so much history, so much of the Exodus that plays out in this story, that it's not unimportant for Gentile readers and Gentile Christians to know that history. And I think like it's exciting for me reading chapter 6 and thinking about, oh man, like what happened in Exodus 14 again? Like what was the wording that they used on the manna and how much they could collect? And there was a wind that was mentioned, in this chapter, and there was the strong east wind that was mentioned. So it's fun to make those connections, even as a non-Jewish person. But I think it speaks to the fact that the Old Testament is still important for us. It's not like, oh, well, you're a Gentile coming to the faith, like, don't worry about this. Like, he's still writing in all of this, these allusions to the Old Testament that I think are important for all of us.
It's pretty neat in verse 2 that the signs do what they're supposed to do. People see it and they follow him. And not everybody is going to listen. So the signs aren't this foolproof thing. But Jesus does these signs to draw crowds to him. He does things purposefully to draw crowds. I struggle with what do you do? How much do you do in order to get people to come and listen? I think maybe an equivalent thing to what Jesus is doing for me personally would be like if I was going to have a Bible study and I had it in Starbucks, and there were 3 or 4 people who showed up at the Bible study. If I bought them coffee and said, "Hey, I'll buy your coffee if you come to the Bible study," that's kind of a similar thing where Jesus is doing this. And it's going to become quickly, readily apparent in the text, the people who are really interested in him and the people who are just kind of looking for something different. And so there's a sense in which I should use what I have to draw people to the gospel in whatever way I can. Like I would be personally much more inclined to go over to your house to have a meal with you and then have a Bible study with you. If I was a non-believer, I would be more likely to do that than to, if you invited me to worship services or something. So as a Christian, I can do something similar to Jesus. I can't perform miracles, but I can invite you over to my house and give you pie. And if that's how I get you to come have a Bible study with me, then I'll bake a pie every day of the week. I also really like pie, so it's kind of selfish on my part. But there's things that I can do like Jesus. And we see him doing anything to get somebody's attention. And then the truth kind of winnows out. The teaching that he does kind of winnows out who is interested and who isn't. And so I think we do have to be careful to avoid taking that and trying to turn Jesus's personal work into something institutional. I don't think that you could say, oh, well, then we should serve steak dinners before worship services to get people to come to the worship service. I think that kind of misses the point of what he's doing. But me personally, I should be using every tool that I have to get you to come and open up the Bible and listen to Jesus. So what are some other things that you guys notice in this crowd, or any comments or thoughts about that?
Well, in regards to that crowd, there was a multitude of reasoning behind all of those people and why we're there. Some were just simply curious. Some might have been hungry. Some might have been really looking for the Messiah or looking to Jesus as being a leader. Some of them did not. And it seems that John refers to the miracles that Jesus did as signs, which is he emphasized the action and not really the marvel of it. And some of these people was fascinated by what he was doing, and they were following him for a lot of different reasons. And I think that's what he was trying to sift things out. And in regards to the signs and the miracles that he did, even the disciples, they were so focused on the intent of how great and miraculous it was, they were missing the point that Jesus was the bread of life. And that the whole idea of all of this the reasoning behind it in regards from Jesus' point of view, that he was trying to help them to understand that he was the giver of life. And in some cases, they didn't quite see that.
I would say also, I mean, you see kind of a warning though here of, as Jesus says, for some future trouble, if you would. We saw back in John, the 4th chapter, where, Jesus condemned the people specifically because he said that unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. So I think you're right, Bob. It's different reasons and everything, but there were those that basically were following him strictly just to see the miracles and the signs.
Mm-hmm.
Another interesting thing I believe I'm right on this. I know John talks about these as signs. I think he records maybe 7 different miracles in his Gospels or something like that. I counted up at one time, but the feeding of the 5,000, I think, is the only miracle that is really recorded in all 4 Gospels, if I remember correctly. And and in each case, the Gospel authors they're using this miracle to show Jesus, who he is, and prove who he is. So just a little bit of trivia, I guess.
The interesting thing about the 5,000, there's also a feeding of 7,000. And just to give you an idea sometimes of where people have gone historically with different numbers and things, people have tried to make the feeding of the 7,000 represent what God does for Israel. And then the feeding of the 5,000, what God does for the Gentiles, he provides for both. Maybe that could be right. I don't see anything necessarily in the text that would lead me to that conclusion. But people do that. It is interesting that this is the only sign. I mean, unless you're going to take the general, phrase, oh, he was healing the sick. I mean, he does that in all the Gospels, but like an actual sign where you have it described to you, this is it. It's the only one that is in all 4. So it's important. Why ever it's included, it's important. And I think it seems like you guys mentioned already, John is doing something different with it than the other writers. He seems to be using it to draw the Exodus account to your mind. And that I think that sets the frame for the rest of the discussion, is the Exodus. And if you're not familiar with the Exodus account, then John 6 is something that you're going to understand in a very different way than if you were focused on the Exodus account. So what do you guys think about the in verse 6 where it says he said this to test Philip? Why do that? Or what do you think is going on in verses 5 through 7?
Maybe we first should note the fact that in John's Gospel, I think it's the only account in the Gospel where Jesus is asking the question, where are we to buy bread, for example, where in the other accounts, it's putting the emphasis on the disciples and having them basically the disciples are initiating the question, and Jesus tells them, to feed the people, first of all. I'll go on and just say this also. When Jesus does ask Philip, he says, where are you going to get the bread to feed them? And I mean, Jesus knows what he's about to do. He just wants to see how the disciples are going to answer the question, basically. He wants to test them and to strengthen their faith, in him, is kind of the way I see it. And, again, he knows where he's headed and everything, but rather than looking to Jesus for the answer and trusting him to provide, the disciples basically look maybe to self-reliance, if you would, and say, well, do we have enough money, yada, yada, yada type stuff, So, and in lieu of saying the fact that, where was their faith, if you would, to look at the problem and turn to Jesus and say, well, you can solve the problem.
It kind of seemed to me that when he asked that question, that he was trying to determine where Philip was at in regards to his looking at it from a spiritual perspective and a physical perspective, because they seem to be locked into this physical perspective. Even when Andrew seemed that he had a problem thinking that he was looking at the more of the physical, and Philip and Jesus seems like he was just trying to determine or get a feel as to where they were at spiritually, because Jesus was the supplier for all the human needs. Jesus knew what he was going to do. It was going to be resolved and taken care of. But where did they stand on it, and how were they looking at it? Seems to me that's why Jesus might have asked that question.
Yeah, with Philip, it's hard to imagine if he truly believes that Jesus can do something about this problem, for him not just be like, well, why don't you just feed him? Like, I think it really is. It's like you said, it's a test of his faith. I think I'm trying to figure out Andrew a little bit more, honestly. I think Philip kind of makes sense to me. Let me run the numbers real quick. Got a lot of people here, 200 days wages, ain't gonna be enough, right? Like, that's more how I think. But Andrew is interesting. I mean, we don't have a whole lot of information on Andrew, but you look back in John chapter 1, and he's one of the two disciples that's sitting with John the Baptist. And John the Baptist says, hey, there's the Lamb of God. And he follows Jesus at that point. So it's like he's pretty quick to believe. He has a faith. It seems like his faith is leading him to action. It's like Jesus asked a question. Let me look around here. I got a guy. Like, here's one guy. I'm not sure what this is going to do, but maybe it's something that can help. I'm just not sure, because it certainly seems like, with the history that we do have of him in this gospel, that he has faith, and he's obviously willing to look around himself and see, what can I do about this, as opposed to just kind of run some numbers like I probably would. But yeah, I'm just kind of curious how much faith, Andrew actually has. If he thinks, well, maybe if the rest of you guys also look, we can find a little bit more than this, what else can we come up with? Or if he's like, Jesus, hey, we got a little bit here. Can we do something with that? And I feel like, as a teacher, we got, a lot of kids, especially at the end of the quarter right now, who not turning in work and things like that. And I'm like, look, if you meet me halfway, I can make that better. I can work with you if you ask a question. I can work with you if you want to sit down and say, hey, this is something I'm having trouble with. I can do something. But if I don't get anything out of you, there's not a whole lot I can do on my end. I'm not going to do the work for you, and I'm not going to raise your grade automatically. And I kind of feel like that's, I don't know, maybe something that Andrew was going for, but certainly something that Jesus was going for. Maybe it's like, just give me something and we can make a miracle out of it, right? But if everyone just says it's impossible, then what's Jesus going to do at that point? I'm not really sure. But I from that perspective, on Jesus' side, I can kind of understand, like, just give me something. But on Andrew's side, it's a little interesting. Like, what does he think Jesus is going to say to, this small amount of things he's brought forth? Or is he hoping that the other disciples are like, guys, get up and look, stop running the numbers. Maybe there's food here to feed everybody. Like, this kid obviously has more than is enough for him, right? Maybe not. Maybe the fish are really small. I've seen some discussion on that. Like, these could be just like sardine, small things, and maybe that's just enough for him for the day. I don't know, but it sounds like it's possible that this kid brought extra, and maybe someone else did also. But yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of get in Andrew's mind a little bit and try and speculate. What was he thinking?
I guess it depends on his tone of voice when he asks that question. But what are they for so many? Is he, like you're saying, is he leading Jesus with that? What are you going to do with this? Or is it a hopeless tone? Yeah. So a lot of it depends on how Andrew sounds when he says that. So let's read it charitably and let's pretend he's looking for Jesus to do it. So Jesus sits the people down, and we're told that there's 5,000 men. This is how people get numbered often. When the people come out of Egypt, out of the Exodus, it's the men 20 to 60 that get counted. If you were older than 60 or younger than 20, or if you were a female, you didn't get counted in the number. It's not because those people weren't important. It's because what the number that you're being given is the number of fighting men from the tribes. So the Levites don't get numbered either. Well, when they take the census, the Levites won't get numbered. So you're looking at men, probably 20 to 60. And this, Andrew, I don't think anybody went through and polled for ages. They just kind of look and say, well, there's like 5,000 guys here. Clearly there are children. There's a young boy who wouldn't be included in that word men. There may have been women and young girls present too. And so people estimate the number. If you assume there's equal parts, people estimate between 15 to 20,000 individuals, which would be a huge number of people, which explains Philip saying we would need 200 denarii. It's just a huge number of people. We're not given a number, so all we know is about 5,000 or 5,000 plus. Be anywhere between 5 and 20,000 people. But he has them sit down, and then he feeds them, and they're going to gather up the lost fragments. And at the end of that, the conclusion is in verse 14, this is the prophet who has come into the world. So how do you guys get from sitting in groups, eating bread, and then saying Jesus is the prophet? What's going on there? Or what are some things that you guys notice in that section?
Well, first of all, if we were to look at it from a practical standpoint, if you've ever been to a concert or somewhere where there's a multitude of people, I mean, thousands, and in this case, he wanted them to sit down on the grass where it was available. There had to be some sense of order in order for everything to be resolved, the questions answered. It would be an absolute chaotic situation with so many people. And yet it seems like everything went as planned, as Jesus wanted. And there was a purpose involved. And in all practicality, it would seem like it would be such a chaotic situation.
Not to take us off the point, I have a question for the panel. Is there any significance of sitting on the grass here? You're in a barren area. I mean, would you expect to be a lot of grass here in this area on the east side of the Sea of Galilee and everything?
I have no idea.
I saw where somebody, when somebody wrote that maybe, I mean, again, don't take that out of text and everything, but in an area where you have this grass and everything, was John even maybe inferring about Jesus, where Jesus is, there is life, for example? That's maybe a real stretch, but I'm just curious if anybody had any ideas.
I did read something, but I'm looking for it. So give me a second, and I'll give you a little side note if I can in a minute.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. I've read some explanations, and we go through Revelation on Wednesdays, and in one of the places in Revelation, the grass seems to be equated to believers. I don't know that John is doing that here, even though he might do it in Revelation. And so I have seen people go interesting places with that detail. And I wonder if sometimes that's just included to let you know that Jesus isn't making people sit on a bunch of rocks. I mean, they're in a place where seating would be comfortable. I don't know.
Well, I sure don't want to infer anything in the text. I'm just curious more than anything.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer. So
this might partially answer the question. This is William Barclay's Gospel of John. He says, let's see, make sure I'm in the right spot here. Try to cut it down a little bit. The River Jordan flows into the north end of the Sea of Galilee. 2 miles up the river were the fords of Jordan. Near the fords was a village called Bethsaida Julius, to distinguish it from the other Bethsaida in Galilee. And it was for that place that Jesus was making. Near Bethsaida Julius, almost on the lakeside, was a little plain where the grass always grew. It was to be the scene of a wondrous happening. That's what I was remembering.
So it wasn't all barren areas, what you're saying. Okay, makes sense.
So when he feeds them, I have always read the feeding accounts before I started to notice when somebody pointed out to me the echoes in the Exodus that appear all throughout the New Testament. I had always read this as an identification of Jesus with God, with deity, who can create out of nothing or take what exists and create from it. So maybe like looking back to the garden where God takes the man and forms the woman out of her. Here is Jesus doing something like that, taking the bread and the fish and forming more bread and fish from what was already there. So I think that's a valid observation. But when you notice, as you guys have mentioned, all these different references to the Exodus, there's also this idea where Moses is the provider of food, not Moses, but God through Moses. And, all throughout the wilderness, the people of Israel get bread and meat from God. And so it's almost like here, what you're seeing is the same thing happening. And I think that's why we run into that conclusion in verse 14, where they say, this must be the prophet who comes into the world, referencing back to Deuteronomy 18, where Moses says, there is a prophet like me who is coming. And when they see Jesus give them food, in their mind, they probably think back to Moses and the bread coming out of heaven and the quail being brought to the people, and how for 40 years, every day, the people had all they needed to eat. And now here is a man who is able to pull food seemingly out of the air. He is doing what Moses did. And I think that picture is what is going to lead us into the discussion in the rest of John chapter 6, is this Exodus theme with the bread coming down out of heaven. And that seems to be why they go to that conclusion. They seem to know enough to link Jesus to Moses based on this food, which is pretty interesting. Does that make sense? Is there anything else that you guys notice?
Yeah, it seems like there's a contrast of two types of people. Those that were in this group, as you just said, after the people saw the miraculous signs that Jesus did, they began to say, surely this is one of the prophets. So, but the other group, the Pharisees, seem to have rejected Jesus in signs, whether it was signs or miracles, whether it was through stubbornness or their egos, or even admitting that they may be wrong. They just didn't see it. And it just seems like there was two types of understandings in receiving Jesus and who he was and what he did.
Yeah, I think this question they're asking about, how are we going to feed these people? It must be a question that the people themselves were asking. It's just like, certainly, we've got probably a lot of them bringing something, but maybe didn't realize how long they're going to be out there, not having enough necessarily even for themselves or for other people to share. And so, when you have Jesus blessing this and like telling everyone to sit down, and then you're like, I don't know if this is going to work. I'm sure we've all pre-COVID been to a birthday party where there's a cake or cupcakes and there's a bunch of people around. You're like, there's not enough for everybody. They're like, everyone's going to get a piece of cake. And you're like, okay, so they all cut it up, and it's kind of like everyone gets a piece of cake, and you look back and you're like, there's actually more cake now left over that people have brought back to the table than there was in the first place. Like this is kind of a miraculous thing. And that's obviously a silly example, but I think that's kind of the idea, is these people are doubting, probably just like they are, that there's enough to go around one way or another. And then they realize, and it says they ate as much as they wanted, right? It's not just like, oh, okay, I'll just take a small piece to make sure everybody else gets some. Everyone gets as much as they want, and then they're still gathering all this extra, all this excess, which is interesting. So certainly, I wouldn't be too surprised if some of the people were eating some of the food they brought also, but it clearly wasn't enough for everybody the way that had planned out. But Jesus provides for them, and there's more than enough, and that's when they eat everything they want. So I imagine some of those same things. There's probably a lot of Phillips in the crowd going, not enough, right? And then at the end, they're like, how did he do that? It's like only one person can do that. And especially when you make references to people they would have known, like Moses in the Old Testament, it's probably not too big of a leap, because they're like, how else?
And that leads you to verse 15, which when I read that, I don't think of Moses as a king. I mean, he's not a king. But the rabbinic writings that we have and other different writings that we have from around this time and even beforehand, they reference Moses as a king. And so even though he's never called a king, the text, the Old Testament text never calls Moses a king. They saw him, the same word that's used here, this ruler, this leader that they're trying to make Jesus into, that word will be used to talk about Moses. And so in verse 14, when they say, oh, here's the prophet who's come into the world, linking Jesus back to Moses, in their minds, in the first century, it would not have been a leap to then assume that Jesus is going to be a king also, because they thought of Moses as a king. And so for a long time, I misunderstood verse 15. I thought, oh, well, they want Jesus to be king now so they can get a bunch of free bread. And I mean, that may be part of it, but they wanted Jesus to be the king because they saw him as Moses. And if Moses was the ruler, then this new prophet, surely he must be a ruler too. And so they're going to come and make him the ruler. And once that connection was made for me, once I read some people who pointed that out, all of a sudden those two verses didn't seem disjointed. It made sense. Oh, they see him as Moses, and so they just want him to do what Moses did. And then that will connect verse 15 and 14 together, I think. Does that make sense? And so that's something that if you're not familiar with what was going on in the culture at the time, that might seem a little disjointed, but it's a natural movement from one thought to the next for a first century Jew.
And I think the numbers, I mean, you said 5,000 men, you can kind of, the way they count those numbers, they can probably look around, even if they can't estimate it very well. Like, we got some people here. If this is who we think it is, we can take people down. It's not like there's 10 of them and we're like, I guess maybe we'll go to 10 of us, like, no, there's a lot of us, and we can go and storm whoever we need to storm. This guy's gonna be something for us.
So then, we've got a comment. Jay Stevenson said, it doesn't necessarily seem like the people want Jesus to be king only because he could provide a bunch of free meals. It definitely seems like they understand he was the successor to Moses. And I think you're right, Jay. I think that's what's going on. And it helps us understand the argument that they're going to get into in the second part of chapter 6. Because it's not going to fit into their brain that Jesus could be the new Moses, but not bring them bread. And so it's one of those things where once we see that that's the connection that they're making, the rest of chapter 6 makes more sense. And I think it's important that we see that, like you guys mentioned, there's these echoes to Exodus. Like here, Jesus even going to a mountain by himself, just like Moses would go up the mountain by himself. We see a lot of those images here. Echoes, references back to the Exodus account. So what do you got? Let's do 16 through 21 with Jesus walking on the water. What do you guys notice in there? Or what are some things that stand out to you?
Pretty short verses. Number one, I mean, 5 verses compared to the other gospel accounts. I mean, they left the part where Peter tried to walk on the water and sunk, and then and Jesus still in the storm, So, but the key, I think, here to me would be knowing that when the disciples first saw him and they recognized him as Jesus, that the Christ, and they wanted to receive him into their boats. And that was all that mattered to them at that point. I think that was basically the main focus, if you would, of the story to me. He's come to deliver the people, and they wanted him to be there with them.
In this one, it's the words, I think, more. Well, I guess the image helps too, because you have the people of Israel passing through the water in the Exodus account. and here is Jesus walking on the water, and you have that strong wind that blows in the Exodus account to part the water, and here you've got Jesus is actually going to stop the wind. And so, but you have those words in a biblical text. Like if you could imagine your Bible with no chapters and no verses, you just have all the words strung together. The way that people referenced passages was either by quoting just a bit of it, like Jesus will say, in the passage about the burning bush, or quoting a piece of it, like when he's on the cross, he'll say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Quoting the beginning of Psalm 22. Or they also referenced passages by using the same words. It was expected that you would hear those words and that your mind would go back to something. So somebody crossing water with a strong wind, that should take you to Exodus. That's at least one place that your mind should go. So I do think, yeah, you've got this story of here's this man walking on water, and people can't do that. But the idea of water not being an obstacle, the only other person in all of the Bible who water is not an obstacle for is God. God moves water out of the way, brings people through it. God, destroys the creation with water. Water is not an obstacle for God. And so I think that's kind of the point. Anything else you guys notice?
Here's just another miracle that Jesus does by walking on the water. And the three things that I kind of noted was only God could walk on water. God was capable and able to calm the sea and to transport the disciples to their destination. Now, whether this was part of the same miracle or an additional miracle, I'm not sure, but it says, and immediately the boat reached the other shore where they were heading. And it makes you wonder, was that part of this, or was that a whole separate issue? That it happened in a timely fashion. It didn't take forever to do that. Or it doesn't say that they worked at getting through the other side with no wind. They were going to have to row all the way across. So it's interesting in that regard.
Yeah, Jay had mentioned in his comment here, he said, Jesus can teleport, and this is the most casual sentence that could possibly be written about that ability. But you read that they are struggling and fighting the storm and waves, and with Jesus, he got them to the other side safely. I just like all this work that they're putting in. Like, you just kind of wonder, did he just take them over there and just kind of like, let me just get your focus right here, and like, oh look, we made it. Here we are. Just like, I didn't even realize, but they're like, we shouldn't have made it there already by this point. I definitely think it's interesting. But yeah, the strong wind thing got me. I was looking back and forth, Exodus 14 and 16 with the manna and all that stuff. But that strong east wind, I kind of forget about that. With the Red Sea, that it was kind of just pushing this water out of the way. And then it kind of gets you thinking, like, obviously, like you said, Stephen, God is the only one who can do that. And so either way, we have the crossing of a sea by foot. But you kind of wonder if, thinking about Peter, and he was walking on water, and then he starts to sink because his faith wasn't strong enough. You wonder if God knew that their faith was strong enough that they would just walked over the Red Sea in the first place. And maybe it's just kind of like almost showing them what could be possible. Like, I'm going to spread this water. I'm going to use a wind, and you're going to walk across on dry ground because I know that's easier for you. But it'd be a whole lot easier for me if you just had faith and you could just walk straight across. It's like, it's definitely interesting. Sometimes, certainly miraculous. There's no doubt. The Red Sea crossing is amazing. But wouldn't it have just been a whole lot more efficient for everyone just to have the faith they need to walk across like Peter did, but just keep going? And so you kind of see God working with his people and the amount of faith that we have. And like, you could have just made us walk, because that's obviously what you did, but we didn't have enough faith. It's something that I kind of think about when I'm looking at this.
I think that's probably a valid observation, because that makes Jesus greater than Moses. The water split for Moses, which, like you said, it's a miracle, but they had to walk through on dry ground. And now somebody greater than Moses is here. You have all the elements there. You have crossing, you have the wind, you have the water, but Jesus can walk on it. And so I think that's a valid observation. It shows the superiority of Jesus to Moses. That's probably a good spot to stop. We're about out of time. And we'll just roll verse 22 into the next discussion. And so, Ed, did you have any announcements that need to be made? And then you can close us in prayer.
I think Tom took care of all the announcements this morning very well. So I don't know of any other ones that he did not cover. So if you would just join me with closing prayer then, and we'll go from there then. Our loving Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for the opportunity of this afternoon to come together by these virtual means and open up thy word and to study together and to edify and uplift one another. We thank you, Father, for your love for us all and for your abundant grace and mercy we have through Jesus. And we thank you for loving us and taking care of us. We're grateful for your word and the enrichment it brings to our lives each day. And we'd ask, Father, that you would help us to ever stand firm in your word and to have the inner spiritual strength to grow in faith as we study and meditate upon it. Father, we're mindful of those of our family who are struggling with health issues, and we would ask that you would be with them and with those medical care providers that are caring for them. Forgive us, Father, for our sins and for our shortcomings. Help us to always look to you in all things. We again thank you for your love for us. We thank you for Jesus. And it's in his name that we offer this prayer. Amen.
Amen.
Everybody have a good week. Remember the Revelation class on Wednesday night, and we'll see you next Sunday. Adios.